Discover how Irish monks created the most intricate artwork of the medieval world and the extraordinary journey that saved it from destruction.
Chapter 1. The Iona Genesis.
The island of Iona, a lonely rock thrown into the vast, turbulent waters of the North Atlantic, trembled under the relentless wind of 790 as the brutal force of nature collided with the sacred calm of the monastery. The waves, dark and heavy as molten lead, crashed against the jagged basalt cliffs with a deafening crash, sending up plumes of salty, icy foam that settled like frost on everything. The world outside was harsh, unforgiving, and indifferent to human suffering, a realm of untamed elements where surviving each day was a small miracle. However, behind the thick stone walls of the Abbey of St. Columba, in the heart of the ancient scriptorium, there was a completely different reality. The air in this hallowed room was thick, almost tangible, permeated with the deep resinous smell of melting beeswax, the pungent aroma of oak galls used to produce ink, and the specific stuffy smell of hundreds of old parchment scrolls and sheep wool from which the monks' habits were made. The fire crackling in the huge stone hearth fought an unequal battle with the piercing cold rising from the stone floor, casting long, dancing shadows on the raw walls that seemed to have a life of their own. It was here, in this semi-darkness, where the only source of light was the quivering flames of tallow candles, that the abbot of Connacht summoned his most trusted and most skilled brothers.
The monks, dressed in rough, thick habits, the colors of faded moss and peat brown, entered the room silently, like ghosts, with their faces hidden in deep hoods, taking their places on the oak benches with reverence and a silence that heralded the arrival of a moment of historic significance. In the candlelight, their silhouettes emerged from the darkness as in the paintings of masters of chiaroscuro, where every fold of fabric and every carved wrinkle on the face told a story of sacrifice, strict asceticism, and limitless devotion to God. The atmosphere was thickening with every second, filled with unspeakable tension and silent prayer as the gathered brothers stared at their prior, waiting for the words that would forever change the fate of their congregation and be written in golden letters in the book of eternity. The abbot of Connacht stood in the center of the scriptorium, and his figure, tall and thin as a withered oak, seemed to emanate an inner, unnatural light. His face, carved with deep furrows like parched earth in a drought, was hard, but his eyes burned with an earnestness that aroused both fascination and fear. He took a deep breath, and the sound in the absolute silence of the room was like the sound of wind in the crowns of ancient trees. When he spoke, his voice was low, gravelly, but vibrating with a powerful, almost superhuman power, resonating from the stone arches of the ceiling.
Connacht began to tell the story of the vision that had come to him the previous night while he was keeping a lonely vigil in the icy chapel. He spoke of a light so pure and blinding that it could not have come from this world, of choirs of heavenly beings whose voices formed geometric patterns of perfect harmony. With a tremor in his voice that no one had ever heard from him before, he revealed the divine call. They were to create the Book of the Gospels, but not just any book. Not another correct copy of the Scriptures to be read during Mass, but a work that human eyes have never seen before. It was supposed to be a book that was the absolute, final testimony of God's glory, a manifestation of His power and love, framed by calf parchment and noble dyes. The abbot, raising his clenched fists, stated with absolute conviction that this could not be an ordinary craft. This must be the work of angels, not men. Every ounce of gold, every drop of the most expensive ink, every curve of the smallest letter must have vibrated with holiness.
It was no longer just about flawlessly copying the sacred texts of the evangelists. It was about weaving the very essence, the very living pulse of their deep faith into every stroke of the pen, into every tiniest vibrating swirl of ink. This book was to be a beacon for souls lost in the darkness of barbaric ages, a relic more powerful than the bones of saints, because it was to contain the living word dressed in the robes of heavenly beauty. Connacht spoke, and his words fell like sparks on a dry fuse, igniting in the monks' minds images of indescribable splendor, transcendent beauty that would be born from their hands here on this windswept piece of land forgotten by men.
The reaction of the gathered monks was a complex mixture of deep, almost paralyzing admiration and blood-curdling fear. At first he was answered only by silence, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the sound of the wind blowing against the thick shutters. What the abbot was talking about went beyond the limits of human understanding and previous monastic practice. The scale of this undertaking was so gigantic and the ambition so unimaginably great that for some it even bordered on the sin of pride, the heresy of trying to equal the creative act of God himself. A quiet, muffled whisper spread throughout the scriptorium as the older brothers began to exchange anxious glances. They understood immediately, without having to do any calculations, that this project would consume all of the monastery's already meager resources. This would require slaughtering entire herds of cattle to obtain the highest quality vellum, bringing pigments more expensive than gold from across the great seas and deserts, and, most importantly, sacrificing their entire lives, every waking hour, and decades of murderous, sight and spine-destroying work by the most talented craftsmen of the assembly. Some of them will certainly not live to see the end of this task. This was not a one-season or one-decade project. It was a pact made for an entire generation, a promise that could lead the abbey to ruin if Earth's winters proved too harsh and the harvests too poor. And yet, despite this justified fear, the abbot's vision planted a seed in their hearts that immediately began to sprout. The thought of creating something eternal, something that would survive the teeth of time and the tumult of falling kingdoms, was extremely tempting and awakened a dormant spark of inspiration in their souls. They realized that they were faced with a choice between a safe existence or a leap into the abyss of divine inspiration.
In the corner of the scriptorium, where the candlelight fought against the encroaching darkness, sat Brother Culan, the monastery's chief illuminator. Culan was an extraordinary man, a figure as if taken from another era. While the abbot continued to speak, Culan seemed absent, his mind already drifting in completely different spheres. His eyes, bright and keen as those of a bird of prey, did not see the world as other mortals saw it. For Culan, all of creation, from the pattern of veins on a dry leaf, through the flight of a flock of starlings, to the waves lapping the shore of Iona, was an infinite, intricate network of patterns, fractions of divine geometry. He didn't just hear the words, he saw them. In his head, the letters of the gospel immediately began to transform into forms pulsating with life, entwining each other in endless, mesmerizing tangles of Celtic knots. With his head bent almost to his knees, Culan unconsciously traced his stylus across the cool, rough surface of the slate tablet. With each movement of his hand, driven by an internal trance rhythm, a complex pattern of interwoven ribbons emerged from the gray stone, into which he wove the elongated necks of fantastic birds and hounds devouring their own tails, symbolizing the eternity and inseparability of divine nature. The sound of the stylus scraping against the slate was like a prayer to him. Coulon knew that the Book of the Gospels could not consist of words alone. It had to be a labyrinth in which the demon's eye would get lost in its attempt to desecrate the sacred text, and the human soul would find its way to the contemplation of the absolute. His hands, although scarred and calloused from years of working in the cold, moved with balletic grace, precisely calculating every curve and angle, creating a sketch of a miniature that would later become a gateway to another world on the pages of the big book.
Not far from Cuanya, like a silent granite monolith, sat Brother Donnan, the undisputed master of calligraphy and the abbey's chief scribe. While Cuanya's mind was a chaotic courtyard full of wild plant weaves and fantastic beasts, Donnan's soul was the embodiment of absolute order, rigor, and structure. His hands, large and strong and stained with garnet stains from years of contact with iron gallium ink, were as sure and steadfast as the ancient, wave-resistant standing stones scattered around the island. Donnan stared at the abbot, the gears of ruthless technical calculation already turning in his head. He considered the ideal proportions of the insular capital, the perfect balance between the thick line of the letter's body and its delicate, hair-like finish. He imagined the rhythm of writing, the steady beats of a bird's feather on tight parchment, which for him were the heartbeat of God himself. Donnan knew that Cuanya's brilliant, crazy illustrations would only be empty images if they were not anchored by the absolutely perfect, majestic, and flawlessly rhythmic text of the Word of God. The Scripture had to be as level as a field of angelic troops ready for battle, unwavering and powerful. In his mind, text was not just a carrier of information, it was the supporting structure of the entire universe. His breathing slowed down, synchronizing with the imaginary rhythm of dipping the pen in the inkwell and making precise signs, each of which had to be a small masterpiece, an independent monument erected to the glory of the Creator, not allowing itself the slightest tremble of human weakness.
Deep in the hall, a quiet rhythmic sound attracted the attention of the trained ear, introducing an element of the brutal physical reality of the materials into the spiritual atmosphere. Before word and image could unite in a sacred dance, a foundation had to be created, and its birth required strength, patience, and sweat. Two powerfully built monks, having thrown off their outer habits, fought against the stubborn material, stretching the freshly tanned skin of a young calf onto a massive wooden frame called hearses. This skin, previously soaked for many weeks in a caustic lime solution, stripped of hair and tissue remnants, was now extremely flexible, but also extremely resistant. Their muscles strained to the limit as they used wooden pegs and leather thongs to stretch the wet material. Then, using special crescent-shaped knives, the so-called lunulum, they began to scrape off the microscopic layers of the epidermis with murderous precision. Each movement had to be calculated down to the millimeter. A cut that was too shallow would leave a rough spot that would not accept ink, and too much pressure could tear the skin in a split second, ruining weeks of preparation and destroying priceless material. The scraping sound was sharp and unpleasant, like the grinding of teeth. It required almost meditative concentration. The smell of raw leather and sharp lime mixed with the aroma of wax, creating a specific scent bouquet of the scriptorium. The monks knew that to create a gospel of this size, they would have to sacrifice hundreds, perhaps thousands of the most delicate calves, carefully selected so that their skin would be free from blemishes, from insect bites or scars. This process was a kind of alchemy, the transformation of the brutal, bloody mortality of the animal into a pure, pristine white, translucent plane of eternity on which the Word of God was to be written.
In another corner, Separated from the rest to prevent dust from contaminating the workstations, knelt a very young novice, whose face, still smooth and devoid of deep wrinkles, expressed absolute pious concentration. In his hands was a heavy agate mortar, in which he was grinding small lumps of the strange, blue-gray stone with infinite patience. It was lapis lazuli, a mineral so rare and valuable that it was mined in the distant exotic mountains on the eastern reaches of the known world, and it had reached Iona via trade routes through dozens of hands, paid for in gold weighing more than the stone itself. The novice, with a rhythmic repetition resembling a heartbeat, crushed hard rock, adding drops of resin and wax as well as mysterious binders, according to recipes passed down in whispers. Slowly, from the gray, dull dust, a color began to emerge that took your breath away, a deep, ultramarine blue, a color so intense, vivid, and pure that it seemed to glow with its own inner light, like a fragment of the sky itself trapped in a stone bowl. The boy knew that he had a huge responsibility in his hands. This blue was to be used in the future to paint the robes of the Virgin Mary and the heavenly spheres around the figures of the evangelists. This arduous, physically exhausting process was an act of the utmost humility. The novice did not create great visions or write texts, but without his Benedictine patience and the pain in his arms, the angels in the abbot's vision would be gray and lifeless. It was in this silent grinding of precious minerals, in this slow transmutation of earth into gems, that the true light was born to illuminate the pages of the great book.
After the initial shock and bustle had subsided, a tense silence fell over the scriptorium as Brother Cuan and Brother Donnan looked at each other across the rows of oak lecterns. They had known each other for years. They were like two sides of the same coin, complementary forces of chaos of inspiration and rigor of execution. Their eyes met, and in that one look there was all the awareness of the monumental weight of the task they were undertaking. They both realized the inevitable friction that would arise during their years of working together. Cuan will demand more space in the margins, eager to expand his visionary illuminations, devouring priceless space, while Donnan will defend the integrity of every inch for the majestic rhythm of the columns of text. They knew that they would face a struggle over the composition of each of the hundreds of pages, and endless arguments over the proportions between paint and ink. And yet, beneath the surface of these professional differences, they shared a deep, silent understanding and mutual respect. They exchanged slow, dignified nods. They understood in that very moment that the gospel book would become their life's work, their prison, and their final liberation. This work will surely squeeze the vital juices out of them, spoil their eyesight in the twilight of winter days, twist their fingers from constantly holding the pen and brush, and perhaps drive them to the brink of madness due to the pursuit of unattainable divine perfection. Yet they accepted this fate with silent determination. For them, it was no longer just a job. It was a vocation in its purest, most uncompromising form, a voluntary sacrifice on the altar of art and faith.
The abbot of Connacht, seeing the struggle in the hearts of his monks, their fears mixing with their emerging enthusiasm, stepped forward, raising his hand high to silence the last murmurs. Candlelight danced across his face, making him look like an ancient prophet. "My brothers," he said, his voice softer but full of passionate persuasion, "the world beyond these walls is sinking into darkness. Pagan fleets prowl the seas, kingdoms fall in blood and ash, and human knowledge slowly sinks into the oblivion of oblivion.
We are the keepers of the flame." His eyes pierced each of the monks individually. "This gospel book that we will create together will not be just an inanimate object. It will be a weapon in spiritual warfare, a shield of light against all-encompassing darkness. Even if no one but us sees it in our lifetime, even if we bury it in the ground before the enemy comes, the very fact of its existence, the very testimony of our devotion and pursuit of absolute beauty, will be an act of rebellion against chaos and decay." The abbot looked up at the dark ceiling, as if he could see only the stars through the stone. He explained to them that each letter, each line drawn, would be a song of praise, a prayer recorded forever in matter that would echo for millennia. He spoke to their deepest instincts, transforming their fear of effort into a sense of holy mission, promising that through this murderous Benedictine work they would save not only the achievements of civilization, but above all their own souls. The abbot looked up at the dark ceiling, as if he could see only the stars through the stone. He explained to them that each letter, each line drawn, would be a song of praise, a prayer recorded forever in matter that would echo for millennia. He spoke to their deepest instincts, transforming their fear of effort into a sense of holy mission, promising that through this murderous Benedictine work they would save not only the achievements of civilization, but above all their own souls.
The abbot's words acted like a spark thrown on a pile of dry brushwood, triggering the final transformation in the souls gathered. Fear and doubt evaporated, replaced by a powerful, unifying wave of deep religious exultation. One by one, slowly and with extraordinary seriousness, the monks began to rise from their hard benches. Older brothers leaning on gnarled walking sticks, strong craftsman monks with hands calloused from work, skillful calligraphers with ink stains on their fingers, and finally, young wide-eyed novices all stood in a large, tight circle around their prior. Not a single word of command was uttered. They were guided by a common impulse, a silent command of the Spirit. The abbot of Connacht stretched out both hands, palms facing upwards, and the monks spontaneously began to imitate his gesture, placing their hands on his, clasping them together in a gesture of absolute solidarity and brotherhood. They closed their eyes, and a soft, growling sound escaped their lips, which quickly grew into a powerful, deep Gregorian chant that resonated with the foundations of the island itself. It was their wedding, a vow made not before a king or emperor, but before God himself and before each other. They vowed to dedicate their bodies, minds, and spirits to a task that infinitely surpassed them. In the glow of the flickering candle flames, their joined hands were a living sculpture of unwavering determination, a spiritual seal of the pact that from that night would determine their every breath, every heartbeat, until the day when their names would be obliterated by time and only their great work would remain.
The gathering slowly began to disperse, each to his own preparations, but the electrifying energy of the decision was still in the air. The scriptorium on Iona, though from the outside it seemed only a cold gray structure among the rain-swept rocks, burned within with an invisible fire. Outside, the icy wind from the North Atlantic continued to howl furiously, throwing handfuls of salty rain against the small, thick window panes, as if the furious forces of nature and chaos were trying to break in and extinguish the freshly ignited spark of the human spirit. The ocean roared, and the night was black and endless, symbolizing the dark ages in which they lived. But within these ancient stone walls, something indestructible was born. From this small seed of determination, in this poor room, smelling of wax and damp wool, a miracle was to grow. Their silent, dogged determination was like the faint flame of a single candle lit in the very center of a vast, indifferent darkness, a flame that, contrary to all logic and probability, not only did not go out, but would turn into the blinding light of art and faith, known for millennia to come as the Book of Kells, an undeniable triumph of beauty over barbarism, and eternal proof that even in the darkest hours the human spirit can reach the angelic realms.
Chapter 2. The Scribe's Hand, the Artist's Soul.
The scriptorium on the austere, wind-swept island of Iona was not just a mere room within the monastic walls. It was the living, beating heart of the entire sanctum of faith, a sacred refuge suspended in a delicate balance between the merciless, destructive elements of the outside world and the infinite, unshakable peace of divine eternity. While outside the icy winds from the North Atlantic howled like damning spirits, beating furiously against the thick, irregular blocks of blackened stone and carrying with them particles of sea salt and driving rain, the interior of this sacred workshop emanated absolute, inviolable silence, broken only by the steady, meditative breathing of a dozen monks and the hypnotic, quiet creaking of bird feathers moving across the walls, stretched sheets of vellum. The air inside was thick and heavy, filled with the deep, earthy aroma of burning peat smoke that seeped from the central fireplace, mingling with the sharp, metallic scent of oak galls, the organic scent of animal hides, and the sweet, resinous note of melting beeswax. This space, deliberately devoid of all comforts and distracting details, forced the mind to immediately shut itself out from earthly concerns. Every architectural element, from the massive oak beams supporting the low ceiling to the narrow, gun-like slits of windows through which the pale, cold daylight filtered, was intended to remind the brothers of the severity of their calling. With each passing day crossing the massive threshold of the scriptorium, the monks in their rough, woolen habits the color of moss and peat put aside their individual identities, becoming nameless, humble instruments in the hands of the Creator, willingly immersing themselves in an ocean of work that required not only superhuman physical precision, but above all an unwavering, fervent faith, capable of surviving decades of monotonous, exhausting toil.
Before any letter, even the smallest dot or the thinnest line could be finally poured onto a white surface, there was a long, even mystical process of preparing the matter itself, a kind of alchemy of sanctification in which what was raw and earthly was slowly and reverently raised to the rank of sacred to become a worthy carrier of the Word of God. The parchment on which they were to work was not simply writing material. It was the highest quality vellum, obtained with extraordinary difficulty from the skins of unborn or youngest calves, which was a huge sacrifice for the entire agricultural community of the island, giving up its most valuable resources on the altar of art and faith. The process of processing it resembled a cleansing ritual. The skins were soaked in acrid solutions for weeks, then mercilessly stretched over wooden frames to the limits of the material strength, and finally scraped hundreds of times with razor-sharp crescent-shaped knives, and finally patiently polished with rough pumice until they became as thin as a parchment leaf, as smooth as the surface of a frozen lake, and almost transparent when held up to the light. The creation of inks had an equally sacred character. Black ink, which was the blood of the manuscript, was made from oak galls collected in distant forests, crushed and boiled for a long time with iron sulfate, gum arabic, and a bit of wine or vinegar, which created a liquid of such a deep, light-absorbing black that it seemed to contain the very essence of infinity.
The brothers responsible for these preparations treated their dirty manual labor with the same reverence with which a priest raises the chalice during Mass, aware that without their sacrifice, without their scarred and black-spotted hands, the brilliant visions of the scribes and illuminators could never have come into being in the physical world. In the very center of this hallowed microcosm, at the highest and best-lit desk, stood Brother Donnan like a stone statue, an undisputed master of calligraphy, whose mind and body, after several dozen years spent in the scriptorium, seemed to be only an extension of the divine will, a perfect vessel through which the eternal truth was to take a visible, tangible form. Donnan did not simply write, he performed a constant liturgy in which each line, each arc, and each space between signs carried a specific prayer intention, and his breathing naturally, unconsciously synchronized with the rhythm of his strokes, creating a hypnotic dance of man and tool. His tool was not just any pen, but a carefully selected feather from the wing of a wild swan, a bird symbolizing purity and the transition between worlds in Celtic mythology, which Donnan himself cut with a tiny sharp knife at a perfect angle developed over decades, guaranteeing optimal ink flow. This old monk's world had shrunk to an absolute minimum. The pain in his stiff joints had disappeared, the cold coming from the stone floor had disappeared, the rumbling in his empty stomach reminding him of his fast had disappeared. All that remained was the blinding white of the vellum, the hypnotic black of the ink, and the sacred text of the Latin Vulgate, which he had to transfer from his impermanent memory to a material that would survive the coming millennia. In this space of deep concentration, there was no room for the slightest error, for a shadow of hesitation or trembling of the hand, because it was believed that each letter was a direct embodiment of the divine word, and any distortion of it would constitute an act of sacrilege, an insult to the majesty of the Creator himself, who watched their work from heaven.
Brother Donnan's narrow arthritic fingers, rough from constant contact with the skin, closed gently with a practiced, almost tender precision on the tube of the swan's feather, and his faded blue eyes focused on a microscopic fragment of perfectly prepared vellum, ready to receive the first monumental letter of the new chapter of the Gospel. The pen touched the surface, and in a split second, a black, thick liquid flowed down the perfectly cut nib, soaking into the thirsty structure of the animal skin. The monk's hand made one smooth, sure, and uninterrupted downward movement, creating a perfectly straight, perfectly saturated body of the letter, which was immediately joined by a sensual, rounded belly with equally inhuman precision. This letter, drawn in the classic, austere, and at the same time extremely elegant style of insular capital, was a masterpiece of proportions and geometry. Its edges were sharp as the cut of a sword, the transitions between thick and thin lines were as fluid as the movement of a wave, and the black ink against the creamy vellum background created a contrast so powerful that the sign seemed to almost vibrate, detach itself from the background, and exist in 3 dimensions. For Donnan, that split second in which the ink left the pen and set forever on the parchment was an act of the purest theophany, a direct communion with the divine, in which the Latin words telling of Christ's miracles became flesh of ink, able to speak to future generations long after the scribe's bones had turned to dust beneath the graveyard soil. This uncompromising precision, repeated thousands of times during each murderous day, required not only craftsmanship, but also complete quieting of the ego, submission to the rhythm imposed by the text, where the writer became a servant of every word, every syllable, giving all his life energy to maintain absolute, almost inhuman perfection of form until the very end of the voluminous volume.
On the other side of the scriptorium, where the pale, diffused light filtering through the narrow slits in the windows fell at a slightly different, more benevolent angle, stretched an entirely different realm, the domain of Brother Kuan and his team of illuminators, a world where the strict, ascetic solemnity of black ink and rigorous text gave way to a true yet controlled explosion of color. In this zone, quiet discipline met the hidden joy of creation, and on the desks, instead of monumental columns of text, there were rows of tiny clay bowls and shells containing pigments more precious than gold, brought from the furthest mythical reaches of known civilization to pay homage to the majesty of God. There was the deep, mesmerizing blue of lapis lazuli, a precious metal transported on the backs of camels over the treacherous mountains from distant Afghanistan, which the monks patiently ground for hours in mortars. There was a poisonous yellow, toxic auripigment ore, reminiscent of the congealed rays of the sun, and the vivid, pulsating red of menium lead, the preparation of which required special care due to its poisonous fumes. To Kuan, a man with the soul of a poet and the mind of a mathematician, these colors were not mere dyes, they were physical substances, they were trapped light, fragments of divine glory that combined with the glera, the binder of beaten egg whites, brought life to the dead parchment, injecting vibrations of heavenly beauty into the book, designed to dazzle and elevate the spirit of anyone who ever laid eyes on these pages. Work in this part of the scriptorium resembled a quiet hive. Assistants were constantly mixing paints, ensuring the appropriate humidity of brushes made of the softest squirrel or marten hair, while senior illuminators, with heads bowed and holding their breath, applied microscopic drops of color into previously prepared geometrically drawn spaces, bringing to life complex patterns with a precision that was dizzying.
On this particular tense morning, Brother Cullen and his most trusted, experienced assistants stood silently over a vast, terrifyingly blank sheet of top-quality vellum, beginning to plan the architecture of the most important, complex, and mystical page of the entire manuscript, the monumental Kai Rho page. This page, intended to inaugurate the Gospel according to St. Matthew and describe the birth of Christ, could not be simply decorated. It had to be a visual, vibrant theophany in which just 3 Greek letters, Chi, Rho, and Iota, constituting the Saviour's monogram, were to grow into a cosmic spectacle, devouring all available space and transforming the Word into a pure geometric image. The monks used ivory compasses, hard oak rulers, and thin leaded silver styluses to draw a grid of mathematical proportions invisible to the uninitiated, based on sacred geometry and the golden ratio, believing that God was the supreme architect and that numbers were the language with which he described the universe in the act of creation. With his eyes closed, Callan visualized the structures hidden in his mind, and then his hand, as steady as the arm of an astrolabe, began to mark the first, barely noticeable points and arcs on the parchment, mapping infinity on a finite plane, building the skeleton of a cathedral structure from lines that would soon bear the weight of billions of interwoven details, without losing the internal harmony and legibility of the central message. This stage required the artists to completely combine logic with mysticism, because the slightest error in the initial calculations, shifting the center of gravity of the composition, even by the thickness of a human hair, would cause a catastrophic disruption of the final pattern, ruining months of future work and destroying the theological meaning of the entire work, which was supposed to testify to the perfection of God's plan. The art that was born at a murderous pace under their skilled fingers was by no means just a vain aesthetic decoration intended to please the eye. It was a deep, dense visual theology, an encrypted philosophical treatise in which every, even the smallest detail, every loop of line and every choice of color carried a hidden spiritual meaning, readable only to those who could see with the eyes of the soul.
The stunning carpet pages, so named because of their dense, impermeable geometric structure that covered the entire manuscript's enormous folio, displayed endless, impossible to untangle Celtic knots, each symbolizing God's eternity, a being without beginning and without end, the path of the soul ascending through the maze of earthly trials towards ultimate salvation. Between the hard, ruthless laws of geometry writhed extremely complex weaves of zoomorphic wild beasts, fantastic dragons, snakes and birds devouring each other and intertwining their unnaturally elongated limbs in a mad dance of survival, which was a powerful metaphor for the chaos of disordered matter and the pagan world that is finally captured, bound and ordered by the Christian structure, the framework set by the cross and the gospel. The most fascinating, however, were the tiny human faces, almost invisible at first glance, masterfully woven into the thicket of abstract forms. Some claimed that they were images of the scribes themselves, humbly hiding in the shadow of their work. Others saw them as guardian angels, protecting the sacred text against demonic forces, reminding us that the art of creation was in fact an act of spiritual battle fought on the front of vellum. In this way, the monks of Iona transformed their isolation, the darkness of the outside world, and the heritage of their Celtic ancestors into triumphant Christian beauty, creating a work so multidimensional that its contemplation was to act as
among the many breathtaking miracles that slowly took shape in the semi-darkness of the monastery scriptorium, the most magical process, bordering, in the eyes of observers, almost a miracle of physical transmutation, was the application of leaves of pure gold onto vellum, a task requiring such absolute inhuman precision and control that the monks assigned to this work often fasted from dawn and prayed for the stability of their hands and the purity of their breath. First, the master gently applied a layer of sticky binder, a mixture of garlic juice and beaten egg white, to the parchment, building a slightly convex cushion on which the precious metal would rest. Then he pulled out from the parchment notebook a gold leaf that had been previously beaten to the thickness of a fraction of a human hair, so light and delicate that a more violent movement of air or a faster heartbeat could turn it into useless dust flying towards the floor. There was a moment of absolute holding of breath throughout the entire wing. The monk, leaning over the desk, did not use his hand or tweezers, but used his own mastered exhalation, blowing an extremely gentle, warm, and constant stream of air to, with incredible gentleness, transfer and arrange the gold leaf on the sticky prepared surface, forcing the metal to adhere perfectly to the edges of the drawn letters. Once the gold had adhered, the polishing process took place. The craftsman would use a smooth dog's tooth or a piece of hard agate mounted on a wooden handle to rub the surface of the metal, pressing it against the vellum with measured force until the dull flake began to glow with a dazzling mirror-like luster, reflecting light in a way that had no parallel in nature, and in a dark, smoky room resembled a sudden revelation of a divine ray. The sight of this golden glow suddenly shining against the cool parchment was a moment of deep spiritual movement for the brothers, clear proof that their arduous, physically exhausting work could create a window to a higher, heavenly reality, where the light of Christ finally dispels the darkness of ignorance and death, bringing hope and eternal salvation to the world. However, this monumental, multi-generational effort could not continue and develop without the constant transmission of accumulated wisdom, and one of the most important links in this fragile chain of generations was the youngest novice, Finian, a boy with a rare, almost innate talent for craftsmanship, but a mind still too restless, torn between a secular past and strict monastic discipline.
Finian came from a proud warrior clan, and the echoes of the brutal battles and passions of the outside world still echoed dully in his blood, making it difficult for him to achieve the state of deep inner silence that was absolutely necessary to work on such subtle and sacred forms of art. His imagination was wild, full of vivid images that he now had to brutally tame and force into the rigorous mathematical framework of insular weaving. His current extremely demanding task, assigned to him by his master as a test of humility in craftsmanship, was to complete the complex border design of continuous triple spirals and trumpet ornaments decorating the margin of the page containing the genealogy of Christ, a work in which the mathematical precision of the arcs did not forgive even the slightest millimeter tremor of the young hand. For Finian, this task was not just a technical challenge, but a real internal spiritual struggle. On the one hand, he felt in his fingers the hot, youthful need to act quickly and create intuitively, and on the other hand, he was faced with the icy resistance of matter and the need to absolutely subordinate his creative will to a strict, inviolable scheme that was approved by the elders. Watching him struggle was like watching a wild horse feel the weight of the saddle for the first time. It was visible in...
The hours passed mercilessly, blurring into a monotonous river of time, and young Finian's initial eager enthusiasm began to inevitably turn into growing, almost physical and painful frustration as the complex triple spiral pattern he had been painstakingly working on stubbornly refused to yield to his artistic will, slipping away from the young novice's control with each passing moment. The thick ink seemed to spread maliciously just beyond the lead line of the sketch. The thinnest brushstrokes that should have been as sharp as a knife's edge became blurry and heavy, and the mathematical harmony of the spiral, which had looked perfect in the boy's mind, lost its rigorous curvature on the parchment, turning into a distorted, dirty, and lifeless chaos of spots. Finian's hand, usually steady and agile, began to tremble with fatigue and muscle tension. His back was bent in an unnatural position, and it hurt him unbearably, and the feeling of impending ignominious defeat made sweat bead on his forehead, despite the bitter cold in the shadowy corner of the stone room, increasing the temptation to simply move faster and end the pain. A wave of rebellion was rising in the boy's heart against the tyranny of absolute perfectionism demanded by the rule. He felt the overwhelming, suffocating weight of responsibility, the knowledge that his small, careless mistake could irreversibly destroy the entire page that the other brothers had worked on for weeks, which in his mind amounted to a fault equal to sacrilege, and this fear paralyzed him even more, completely destroying his ability to concentrate. It was a critical moment for every adept of the art of illumination, a moment when the illusion of one's own talent painfully collided with the ruthless matter and spiritual requirements of the sacred craft, a moment of breaking the pride of the creator, who had to realize that without God's grace and deep inner humility, he was only a fragile, fallible vessel made of dust and clay. Brother Kuan, whose sensitive senses from decades spent in silence unerringly registered every, even the slightest change in the dense atmosphere in the scriptorium, immediately sensed the choking tension and silent panic emanating from the young student, and then silently, like a ghost treading on stone slabs, he approached his desk, standing silently behind his tense back. But there was no trace of severity or anger for his mistakes. Instead, with extraordinary fatherly tenderness, Kuan placed his heavy, worn-out hand on the boy's shaking shoulder, letting the warmth and calm of the experienced master slowly, like a balm, flow over the young monk's racing and tormented mind, stopping his desperate movements. The old illuminator leaned down and, in a whisper like the rustle of wind in dry grass, told the boy to close his eyes, take a deep breath, and realize that he was not fighting against matter, but trying to force his own ego onto it. The key to perfection was not to force the brush to obey, but to give up control, to let faith, not muscles, guide the line according to the natural rhythm of the universe. With extraordinary gentleness, Cuan took Finian's hand holding the brush with his old fingers and guided it in a slow, fluid motion across the parchment, teaching him a muscle memory that was based on relaxation and trust. In that one shared stroke, the distorted spiral suddenly found its proper center, its arc once again perfect, supple and full of life, regaining its geometric dignity. This moment of joint action was for the young adept more than just a technical lesson in the craft. It was a moment of true revelation and spiritual breakthrough, in which he finally understood that working in the scriptorium is an act of the highest devotion, a prayer of hands, where pride and frustration disappear in the act of obedience, and master and disciple become one in the service of ineffable beauty.
With each slow sweep of the pale sun across the sky covered with thick, leaden clouds outside, the work in the icy scriptorium became more and more difficult and more demanding, taking a harsh, inexorable, and physical toll on the fragile bodies of the monks who, with a joyful devotion incomprehensible to the world, willingly sacrificed their health on the dark altar of sacred art. The cold emanating from the stone walls inexorably crept under the layers of woolen habits, biting deep into the joints and bones, making the scribe's fingers stiffen, and each tiniest stroke of the pen or brush required a double effort of will to maintain the impeccable quality and rigor of the line, which had no right to betray the fatigue of its creator. The monks' backs, bent at unnatural angles over the wooden desks for hours, days, and years, became gradually, painfully deformed, and their eyesight, constantly strained to the limits of human capabilities while analyzing microscopic details the size of a grain of sand, irreversibly clouded with age, dooming many of the greatest masters to final blindness at the end of their lives. Despite this overwhelming physical suffering and overwhelming exhaustion, there was not the slightest sound of complaint in the room. The brothers were fully, deeply aware that this process was sacrificial and generational, that their transient suffering was being melted into the lasting, indestructible matter of the book, which would shine with divine light centuries after they themselves had become dust. Every painful, cramped hand, every eye blurred with fatigue, was perceived as a voluntary sacrifice, a cornerstone laid for the construction of a magnificent, illuminated cathedral of words, colors, and gold, which, although built hidden from the eyes of the rulers of this world, was the highest expression of tribute to the Creator, and the most important element of the civilizational heritage of humanity in the age of darkness. As the short, merciless winter afternoon inevitably turned into thick darkness, and the Atlantic wind raging outside the island grew furious, repeatedly striking the thick walls of the monastery with a deafening roar like a besieging army, the interior of the scriptorium slowly sank into deep, dramatic, and theatrical shadows, completely changing the perception of the surrounding reality. It was the moment when the brother assigned to this task, with due respect, lit thick, sweet-smelling beeswax candles, and their warm flames, trembling in the wind, revealed the ascetic, deeply wrinkled faces of the monks out of the darkness, painting scenes in the room with such an intense contrast of light and shadow that they resembled the most perfect compositions of the masters of raw chiaroscuro. In this uneven, flickering light of artificial flames, the previously raw, flat pages of the manuscripts suddenly took on an incredible life, pulsating with their own rhythm. The beasts hidden in the braids seemed to move dangerously, the serpentine weaves seemed to writhe, and the bright, saturated colors gained depth and mystery, drawing the viewer into another mystical and dangerous reality on the border of reality and dream.
The candlelight also reflected from the microscopic particles of gold applied during the day, causing individual letters and geometric nodes to glow in the darkness like stars suspended in a vacuum in the night sky, which intensified the mystical experiences and confirmed the brothers in the belief that in these half-darkened walls they were communing with matter thoroughly saturated with the presence of the Holy Spirit. This dance of light and overwhelming darkness was a perfect visual metaphor for their own life and the mission of the order. On an island cut off from the world, surrounded by barbarism, darkness, destruction, and the forces of nature, with determination, willpower, and artistry, they sustained and fed the tiny, priceless flame of knowledge, art, and civilization, guarding it with their own lives against its final extinguishment.
In this extraordinary, flickering, almost unreal and magical light of wax candles, the long-awaited decision was finally made to finally complete work on one of the fully completed, richly illuminated Gospel folios, which has always been in the austere life of the scriptorium an extremely rare moment of deep, shared celebration and exceptionally devout, joyful concentration of all the working brothers. The older and younger craftsmen, tearing themselves away from their desks with relief, gathered in a tight semicircle in complete respectful silence around the main table, and their bowed faces, illuminated by the golden glow emanating from both the flames and the book itself, expressed absolute admiration, mingled with a humble sense of communion with divine perfection and ineffable beauty. The flat, perfectly smooth vellum displayed a riot of stunning colors. The juicy and deep green of malachite perfectly matched the loud and sharp red, and the intricate, vibrant geometric weaves and endless lines drawn around the majestic letters seemed to be not the work of tired human hands, but an entity shaped directly by angelic choirs. No one dared to say aloud words of appreciation or pride, as this would be considered an unforgivable sin of pride, but in the solemn and admiring look of each of those present, in their shallow, synchronous breathing, there was a huge collective satisfaction with the fact that their common, exhausting effort and sacrifice had brought such an unearthly, wonderful, perfect fruit. That one single look at the finished masterpiece in the flickering candlelight was enough to offset months of gnawing pain in their joints, biting cold, and moments of deep, paralyzing self-doubt, giving them the final certainty that their sacrifice had the deepest, unshakable meaning, and that step by step they were building the most powerful monument of faith that man had ever been able to erect for his God. This fleeting but extremely profound moment of shared admiration, mystical union, and silent satisfaction in a well-done, holy work could not last too long, because from the cold monastic tower suddenly came the dull, rhythmic, and ruthless sound of a bronze bell struck by the wind, calling all the brothers to abandon their classes for compline, the last and most important prayer of the passing day. Following the example of perfect monastic discipline that had been inculcated for years, the monks immediately and without a word of protest began to tidy up their workstations, carefully and meticulously washing the priceless brushes, tightly sealing the valuable remnants of rare inks in clay vessels, and protecting the still-drying pages against the destructive humidity of the sea air and the ubiquitous dust from the hearth. They left the hallowed space of the scriptorium one by one, wrapping themselves more tightly in thick woolen habits against the frost of the night that awaited them, passing from the mystical and luminous world of art and colors to the dark, cold, and cool reality of the singing of psalms, preparing their tired souls and bodies to meet the dream that was only an interlude in their endless work.
In the darkened, empty, and already cooling room, all that remained was the magnificent, freshly finished manuscript lying on the oak table, shrouded in deep darkness and guarded only by the faint red embers of the dying fire, gleaming in the darkness like a hidden, sacred jewel, a powerful and unshakable artifact of immortal faith that would silently wait patiently for the coming of another icy, windy, and frosty dawn on the island of Iona.
Chapter 3. Whispers on the Sea Wind.
The years passed on the wind-swept island of Iona with the slow and inexorable rhythm of the ebb and flow of the harsh ocean, carving deep grooves in the monks' faces, like those that salt and water carved into the granite cliffs of their sacred sanctuary. The great gospel, their life's work, grew slowly, page by precious page, becoming not just a book, but a living legend within the walls of the monastery, the beating heart of their spiritual focus and a source of immense yet silent pride. The scriptorium, shrouded in a dramatic deep twilight dispersed only by the flickering flames of wax candles, resembled a living painting by a master of chiaroscuro. The gold foil shone like a trapped sun, and the saturated pigments of lapis lazuli and malachite contrasted with the rough, peaty brown wool of the monks' habits. Every brushstroke was a prayer, every breath praised the Creator, and the scent of oak galls, beeswax, and damp parchment was the incense of their daily offering. They were convinced that their work, due to its heavenly beauty and divine purpose, created an invisible shield around the island, a barrier that the evil of this world could not penetrate. However, the outside world, brutal and unpredictable, began to slowly but inexorably break into their sacred isolation, reminding them that even the most sacred walls stand on an earthly veil. The golden era of limitless peace and creative ecstasy was slowly coming to an end, giving way to something these devoted people had not known for decades, the uncertainty and fear that came with the cold winds from the north. The peace of the ocean, which had previously been treated as proof of God's grace and isolation from the sins of the continent, would soon turn out to be the greatest curse of the island of Iona. One dark afternoon, when the sky was the color of bruised lead and the wind howled like damned souls, a fishing boat reached the shores of Iona, miraculously avoiding being smashed against the rocks hidden beneath the waves. The crew, consisting of local fishermen with bodies decrepit from the cold and faces contorted in absolute animal terror, rushed into the monastery courtyard in panic, seeking shelter with the brothers. Drenched to the skin, shivering from cold and shock, they began to spout chaotic, sobbing stories about dragon ships emerging from the thick fog like sea monsters from nightmares. They spoke of the Northmen, giants with blonde hair and scarred bodies, who had attacked a small, defenseless settlement on the neighboring coast, leaving nothing in their wake but ruins, ash, and a river of blood soaking into the barren land. They described carved wooden dragon heads on the bows of ships that seemed to come to life on the waves, and shields arranged on the sides like the scales of a predatory reptile. The monks, still wrapped in their unshakable sense of security and spiritual superiority, initially rejected these relations. They were considered exaggerated stories of simple people terrified by the storm, inventions born of excess sea salt and fatigue, or perhaps stories about ordinary pirates exaggerated by fear. They tried to calm the fishermen with prayers and hot food, explaining to them that God and Saint Columba spread their fatherly mantle over the island, through which no barbarian tribe would dare to penetrate. However, despite the official downplaying of these reports by the monastery elders, the seeds of concern slowly began to sprout in the minds of the brothers. Whispers, quiet and hissing like snakes in the grass, began to circulate in the corridors, in the kitchens, in the gardens, and in the scriptorium itself, infecting the atmosphere of the monastery with a toxic mix of fascination and growing fear. With each passing day, with each new story brought by traveling traders or rare pilgrims, these whispers grew louder, becoming a dull rumbling that could no longer be ignored. Sea stories did not want to die. On the contrary, they gained in detail and cruelty. The isolation of the island, which for generations had been perceived as the greatest gift from God, allowing for undisturbed contemplation, suddenly began to resemble a trap from which there was no escape. The brothers began to see the world around them differently. The deep peaty browns and mossy greens of the island now seemed darker, more depressing, and the wind rushing through the stone arches sounded like a warning, wailing voice. The psychological change was palpable. The rhythm of daily psalms and prayers was increasingly interrupted by wandering thoughts and nervous glances towards the horizon. The water surrounding the island was no longer a protective barrier, but became a dark highway in their imagination, along which evil forces could arrive at any moment, ready to destroy everything they had worked so hard to build. Tales of northern warriors settled in their minds like icy frost on the stone walls of their cells, never to be forgotten even during the deepest meditations on sacred texts. The real shattering blow came a few weeks later in the form of a weary, sick merchant who landed on the island in his small, damaged merchant ship, bringing news that would change the face of their peaceful life forever. Gathered in the courtyard under a leaden, weeping sky, the monks listened in silence to a man whose eyes had seen unimaginable cruelty and whose voice was breaking under the weight of unspeakable trauma. The merchant was not speaking of a small, nameless settlement, but of Lindisfarne, the great monastery, their spiritual sister, the beacon of Christianity in the north, a place as holy and powerful as Iona itself. In chilling detail, he described how barbarians from the north, pagans who did not believe in anything sacred, descended on the monastery like a plague of locusts, bringing with them fire, steel, and unimaginable destruction. He talked about altars stained with the blood of martyrs, about precious reliquaries smashed into pieces and stripped of gold, about holy books thrown into the sea, and about monastic brothers, people like themselves, brutally slaughtered like cattle or chained and carried away into slavery to frosty lands across the ocean. The merchant's words fell in terrifying silence, each of them like a blow struck at the very heart of the gathering, finally breaking down the wall of ignorance behind which the brothers tried to hide. The news sent a physical, tangible thrill through the gathering on Iona, a chill that shook the very foundations of their faith and self-righteousness. The description of the Vikings, pagans in whose hearts there was no room for mercy and whose minds had no understanding of respect for the Christian God or his earthly homes, was absolutely terrifying and destructive to their existing worldview. The illusion of divine protection that had allowed them to spend their days carving initials on parchment shattered like thin glass struck by a stone. Knowing that Lindisfarne, the jewel of Northumbria, had fallen victim to such a brutal attack meant only one thing: Iona, with its defenseless monks and incalculable riches hidden in the pages of the great gospel, could be next. There was no longer room for illusions. The harsh, brutal reality invaded their sanctuary, forcing an immediate change of priorities from creating beauty to defending their own existence. The image of bloodthirsty invaders desecrating the altar that was for them the axis of the universe.
In the face of this looming nightmare, the abbot of Connacht, a man with wise but now deeply worried eyes, called an urgent meeting of the monastic elders in the dimly lit, gloomy chapter house. The atmosphere in the room was thick and stuffy, and the faces of the monks flickering in the torchlight resembled masks made of fear and uncertainty.
The conversation, which in recent years had been solely about the progress of the great gospel, the selection of pigments and theological interpretations of illumination, now shifted brutally to the issues of survival, protection, and physical security of their work. The abbot, with sadness in his voice, outlined the dilemma they faced, whether to continue their holy work in unwavering faith in divine protection, or to take drastic, pragmatic steps to prepare for the coming evil. The ancient walls of the chapter house, which had previously absorbed only quiet chants and philosophical discussions, now echoed with raised, angry voices, testifying to the deep cracks that had appeared in a previously harmonious community, forced to abandon its innocence in favor of brutal survival in a cruel world. Some of the older monks, led by the zealous Brother Aidan, argued passionately for remaining in prayer and trust in the Creator, claiming that building fortifications and hiding the sacred underground was a sign of weakness of faith, a sin of doubt that could bring even greater divine wrath upon them. Others, with a more sober view of the world's brutality, including the stern Brother Tomas, retorted that God had given them brains to defend themselves, that Lindisfarne had fallen despite the prayers of their brothers, and that it was their duty to their Creator to save His word at all costs. They advocated the immediate construction of wooden observation towers, the organization of regular guards, and the digging of secret crypts and hiding places under the monastery floors in which the great gospel and other relics could be hidden if the worst-case scenario were to come true. The debate in the chapter house exposed the deep theological and psychological crisis they had to face, a clash of pure spiritual devotion with a primal, almost animal instinct for survival, a clash that forever changed the power dynamics and priorities in the monastery on Iona. Ultimately, despite heartache and deep doubts, the abbot of Connacht had to choose the side of pragmatism, understanding that he had a responsibility not only for the souls, but also for the lives of his brothers and the survival of their greatest work. This decision, although necessary, brought with it an overwhelming sense of loss. It marked the end of an era of innocence on the island, an acceptance of the fact that their sacred space was polluted by fear of outsiders.
The scriptorium, once a temple of boundless peace and tranquility, where the only sound was the scraping of feathers on parchment, now pulsated with hidden tension and nervousness. The golden monastic rules were bent to the demands of war survival, and the daily schedule was drastically altered to accommodate hours spent digging in the hard earth, moving rocks, and watching out for the unseen enemy. Brother Kuhan, one of the most gifted illuminators, sat at his desk, holding a brush dipped in the precious ultramarine pigment, but his attention was not on the intricate pattern of the Celtic knot before him. Instead, his eyes kept drifting to the small, narrow window that looked out onto the restless, choppy, and darkened Atlantic Ocean. The waves, once a soothing backdrop to their ascetic life, now reminded him of predatory fangs ready to attack, and every white crest on the horizon made his heart beat faster. Kuan's hand, usually extremely steady and precise, capable of painting the thinnest lines with angelic precision, now trembled noticeably, and a drop of precious blue ink fell onto the table, staining the oak wood in a way that seemed to him a cruelly symbolic harbinger of impending corruption. The sound of the wind against the stone walls, which for years had been a lullaby for the work-weary monks, now carried with it the promise of violent death and destruction, shattering concentration and introducing a paralyzing dissonance to their once so sublime, prayerful work. Following the abbot's orders and under the strict supervision of Brother Tomas, the youngest and strongest monks were organized into systematic guard shifts sent to Dún E, the highest barren hill on the island, which commanded a wide view of the treacherous waters surrounding them. They stood there for hours, wrapped in thick, rough wool blankets that couldn't keep away the biting, icy wind or the salty spray that stung their faces, their eyes watering from staring so hard at the gray ocean. The physical suffering of the cold and wet was nothing compared to the psychological torture they experienced during these long, lonely watches. Every drifting log seemed like the prow of a dragon ship. Every shadow on the horizon became a flotilla of barbarians, and the cries of seagulls sounded like those of murdered brothers in distant Lindisfarne. The tension was so great that some of the young brothers experienced hallucinations from fatigue, setting off false alarms that only intensified the general paranoia and drained the remaining strength of the tormented community. Thus, the island of Iona was transformed from an oasis of spiritual peace into a fortress awaiting siege, a place where fear became as ubiquitous as the overwhelming cold and unrelenting rain. Each night spent in safety was now treated as a rare miracle rather than as a matter of course for the righteous. The falling dusk no longer brought relief or a well-deserved rest after a day of hard work, but only intensified the feeling of claustrophobia and isolation, turning every noise and crack in the dark into a potential prelude to murderous slaughter. The great gospel, resting alone on a heavy oak lectern in an empty, closed scriptorium, glowed in the light of a single dying candle, a painfully fragile symbol of beauty, faith, and human perseverance in the face of approaching, almost inevitable destruction. The contrast between the eternal, intricate splendor of an illuminated book immortalized on calf parchment and the brutal, temporal fragility of the lives of its inspired creators has never before been so drastically sharp and so painful to bear in silence. The monks lay in their cold, Spartan cells with their eyes open, staring into the impenetrable darkness and praying no longer for inspiration for artistic work.
Chapter 4. The First Storm.
The morning on the island did not herald the coming apocalypse, initially appearing as another cold day filled with strict monastic routine, saturated with the smell of burning peat and a salty, sharp wind from the endless Atlantic Ocean. In the scriptorium, the heart of the monastery, where the silence was almost palpable, sunlight barely filtered through the narrow stone windows. It created sharp geometric patterns in the style of deep chiaroscuro on the floor and massive oak desks, bringing out the raw textures of woolen habits and parchment from the darkness. The young novice Finian, holding his breath, pored over the page of the great gospel. His hands, although frozen, applied gold particles with the utmost precision to the intricately woven initial, in which moss green intertwined with the deep, almost mystical blue of lapis lazuli. Around him, other monks were copying sacred texts in absolute concentration, and the only sound was the steady, almost hypnotic scraping of goose feathers on the leather of the calf. This sacred harmony, developed over the years, this microcosm of prayer and art, seemed eternal and untouchable, suspended in time, far from earthly concerns. However, this illusion of security was soon to be brutally trampled. The ominous, deafening sound of an alarm bell rent the morning air, hitting the thick stone walls with the force of a physical blow. It was not a calm call for matins or vespers. It was a crazy, arrhythmic, jerky sound that carried with it the promise of unimaginable nightmare and instant death. The sound of the bell vibrated in the bones, shattering the sacred silence and instilling an icy, paralyzing fear within the walls of the monastery. On a high cliff overlooking the roiling deep blue ocean, a lone ranger stared at the horizon, eyes wide with fear. His hands clutched the bell rope, tearing the skin raw while his mind refused to acknowledge what his eyes were seeing. The slender, predatory silhouettes of Viking longships emerged from the thick morning fog like powerful, mythical leviathans. Their carved, dragon-like prows cut the foaming waves with ruthless precision, and the rows of shields hanging on the sides gleamed menacingly in the pale morning light.
These weren't lost merchants or refugees. They were a storm of doom, a wave of brutal, unstoppable violence coming from the north that was about to hit their defenseless haven. When the bell struck the scriptorium, the disciplined geometric order of monastic life fell apart in a split second, giving way to controlled but hysterical chaos. Ink spilled from overturned inkwells, staining priceless manuscripts in blood-black puddles, and heavy wooden tables were slammed aside. Then the abbot appeared in the doorway, his usually calm, deeply wrinkled face now as pale as wax, and his eyes burning with a feverish, almost fanatical desperation. His voice, though trembling, cut through the growing din of screams and the rustle of clothes. "Leave the gold, leave the silver and reliquaries behind," he thundered, pointing with a shaking hand at the desks. "Save the word, save the great gospel, because it is the soul of this place, and the rest is just dust and clay." This single dramatic command changed the priorities of everyone gathered. Golden chalices, jeweled crosses, and ornate patens were abandoned to their fate as the monks rushed towards what truly constituted their heritage. Holy books, the fruit of decades of arduous, back-breaking work, suddenly became the most important treasure on earth, more valuable than one's own life. Finian, hearing the abbot's words, felt his stomach drop into his throat, and his heart beat against his ribs like a frightened bird in a cage. The young novice rushed to his desk to save the unfinished, still loose foils of the great evil.
Outside, the monastic idol turned into a vestibule of hell. The oak, iron-bound gates to the courtyard, which had only resisted the winds for centuries, gave way under the mighty blows of battering rams and axes, breaking with a deafening crack. A river of tall warriors dressed in leather and chainmail, their faces contorted in inhuman battle grimaces, poured through the gap. The contrast between the defenseless monks, dressed in simple gray and brown habits, and the invaders, shiny with iron and stained with the first blood, was shocking, brutal, and unambiguous. The first monks who tried to block the entrances to the dormitories with their bodies fell dead almost immediately, cut down by single, powerful blows of broad swords, their warm red blood staining the cool, stony gray of the courtyard. A peaceful asylum, a sanctuary of knowledge and contemplation, in the blink of an eye transformed into a slaughterhouse full of incomprehensible cruelty. Violence penetrated the very walls of the temple, trampling on all sanctity with barbaric ignorance. A group of raiders bursting to the main nave of the church, their heavy hobnailed boots echoing off the high Gothic vaults, destroying the acoustics built for Gregorian chants. With cruel laughter, they tore the silk tablecloths from the altars, threw intricate carvings onto the floor, and smashed ancient reliquaries, spilling the ashes of saints to get at the gold fittings. The air, until then saturated with the aroma of beeswax and incense, quickly filled with acrid, choking smoke from dropped oil lamps and deliberately set fires. The fire, initially spreading over the wooden elements of the choir, quickly began to consume the large tapestries hanging on the walls, turning them into burning orange pillars of destruction that cast demonic glows on the faces of the criminals. This sensory nightmare escalated by the second, becoming unbearable for the survivors. There were sounds of unimaginable destruction everywhere, the clang of breaking stained glass through which cold blue light collided with the blood red of the fire, the crack of cracking wood, the screams of those being murdered, and the gasping of dying brothers. This terrible noise was accompanied by the hard, guttural cries of the Vikings in their incomprehensible, harsh language, reminiscent of the growl of wild beasts. The smell of burning wood and melting lead mixed with the iron-like, nauseating stench of fresh blood and the smell of sweat from the hot bodies of warriors.
Finian, crouching in a small gap under the stairs leading to the bell tower, gasped for air filled with hot, eye-stinging smoke, pressing his hands to his ears and endlessly repeating the words of the psalm in the silence of his own mind, asking God for mercy, or at least for a quick, pain-free death. The culmination of his terror came when he heard heavy, steady footsteps approaching the altar behind which the great gospel was hidden. Pressing himself against the wall in his hiding place, his heart pounding so hard he feared it would give away his position, he stared through the narrow gap at the two tall invaders. Their clothes were dripping with water and blood, and in their hands they held heavy iron axes dripping with crimson liquid. They began to methodically devastate the main altar, tearing off silver candelabra and smashing stone sculptures. At one point, one of them stood exactly on the slab masking the hiding place with the manuscript. Finian held his breath, his eyes widening as wide as they could in absolute paralyzing terror. The Viking struck the shaft of his axe against the stone, looking for empty spaces. A dull sound echoed in the ruined temple. The warrior frowned, examining the cracks, but at the same moment his companion screamed, finding a chest with mass wine and golden chalices in the sacristy. The Viking stepped off the slab, and Finian allowed himself a quiet, ragged exhale, feeling a wave of icy sweat flow down his face.
Chapter 5. Cost of Creation. Smoke still hung over the ruined monastery on the island of Iona, drifting lazily like a ghostly gray shroud covering a place that only yesterday was teeming with life, prayer, and holy singing. In the grim, dark aftermath of the brutal invasion of the Northmen, the true and unimaginably bloody cost of this attack became more painfully and terrifyingly obvious by the second to the few who survived the carnage. The monastic buildings, once proud symbols of faith and steadfastness, now lay in complete ruins, their burnt, blackened skeletons of wood and stone reaching towards the sky like accusing fingers. The most precious relics, collected over generations, were mercilessly looted, their shine extinguished in the bags of greedy invaders. All around, among the ruins and mud, lay the massacred bodies of dozens of brothers, their blood soaking into the cold Scottish ground, mixing with the ash and rain. Among the fallen was the master scribe, Dublin, a gray-haired sage with hands that could breathe life into even ordinary parchment. He died a martyr's death, defending the entrance to the scriptorium with his last breath, holding only a wooden cross against steel axes. A heavy, suffocating sadness hung over the island, overwhelming the surviving monks who wandered among the ruins like lost ghosts, unable to comprehend the enormity of the tragedy that had befallen them. Every step was marked by despair, and the nauseating smell of burnt wood, roasted meat, and shattered dreams filled the air, creating an atmosphere so oppressive that even breathing felt like a painful effort. Amid this scenery of ultimate destruction, the world's color palette was reduced to the dreary grays of ash, the dark browns of mud, and the faded, mossy greens of the surviving fragments of vegetation, creating a landscape of hopelessness in which any thought of the future seemed like a grim joke of fate. Shocked and devastated, but still driven by survival instincts and a deep sense of duty, the surviving monks, led by a shocked but determined abbot, gathered in silence to embark on the most important mission of their ruined lives. Their faces, smeared with soot and blood, were illuminated only by the faint morning light breaking through the thick clouds of smoke, making them look like figures straight from dark visions of the end of the world. With heavy hearts and trembling limbs, they moved towards the secret hiding place, hidden deep under layers of peat and stone, where, on the eve of the attack, in an act of desperate foresight, they hid their greatest work.
Step by step, with their hearts trapped in the icy grip of terror, they crossed the ruined courtyard, silently praying that the pagans would not discover this one most important treasure. The ground beneath their feet was slippery with blood and rain, and every sound of the wind made them turn around with panic in their eyes, expecting their executioners to return. When they finally reached an inconspicuous hill at the edge of the settlement, the abbot fell to his knees in the wet peat, and his dirty, cracked hands began frantically brushing away the dirt, grass, and moss, only to reveal, after what seemed an eternity, a heavy oak trapdoor. The physical effort was mixed with enormous mental tension, and the monk's muscles trembled as together they lifted the stone hatch, revealing the entrance to the narrow, musty pit where their last hope lay. The interior of the hideout hit them in the face with the cold and the smell of wet earth, and as the abbot plunged his arms into the darkness, they all held their breath, waiting for fate's verdict. His hands found the smooth surface of the leather thong and the thick, oiled cowhide that provided the first layer of protection. When, reverently, slowly, and with great reverence, he began to pull the heavy package to the surface, there was absolute, almost ringing silence, broken only by the distant, mournful cries of seagulls and the thumping.
Chapter 6. The Fateful Decision.
The inexorable cycle of the seasons, once marked by the gentle changes of nature and the harmonious liturgical rhythm of the holy island of Iona, was brutally and irrevocably replaced by a bloody cycle of raids, repeated with ghastly regularity by the Vikings, whose carved-prowed dragon boats emerged from the thick gray fog, rolling in from the stormy North Sea like vengeful demons sent to test the limits of human endurance. Every time the square sails appeared on the horizon and the wind brought with it the blood-curdling sound of horns, the island was plunged into absolute chaos, in which prayers mixed with screams of terror, and the smell of incense gave way to the eye-biting smoke of burning thatches and the stench of spilled blood. These barbarians knew no mercy or respect for the sacred. Their only goal was plunder, and each of their attacks left behind ruined buildings, desecrated altars, and massacred bodies of brothers who tried to defend their home with their bare hands. After each such cataclysm, those who managed to hide in caves or swamps returned to the smoking ruins to bury the dead with heavy hearts and bleeding hands, rebuild the burned cells, and try to restore order. But with each passing year, this process became more and more difficult, draining them of the last of their vitality and extinguishing the spark of hope for a better tomorrow. The land, once fertile and bountiful, was now soaked with salt from the sea waves that the Vikings carried on their boots, and ash from endless fires, making even the cultivation of staple crops an almost miraculous act in the face of so much destruction. With each successive invasion, the walls of the monastery became more and more fragile, and the souls of the monks more and more exhausted, slowly resembling crumbling stones on a windy cliff that know that the final impact of the wave will eventually plunge them into the bottomless, dark abyss of the ocean. With each passing month of this endless nightmare, the monastic community shrank and disappeared like a wax candle melting in the brutal pull of history, leaving behind only empty cells and a terrifying, debilitating silence in places where joyful, multi-voiced songs of praise once rang from dawn to dusk. In the refectory, where brothers had once gathered shoulder to shoulder, entire rows of wooden benches now lay empty, recalling those who fell to the invaders' axes, died of exhaustion, or in an act of desperation, broke their vows and fled under the cover of darkness to the safer mainland of Scotland or Ireland. The most devastating blow to the morale of the survivors, however, was the complete lack of new novices, as the news of the Viking atrocities and curse on the island spread widely throughout the Christian world, causing no young man to have the courage to come to Iona, to dedicate his life to God in a place that seemed to have been abandoned by him. In this progressive, inevitable decay and physical degradation of everything around them, the only point of support, the only hidden sun in a world enveloped in impenetrable darkness, was the great gospel, a monumental work of art and faith that, despite the conflagration raging around them, still remained intact, pulsing with ineffable beauty in the twilight of the scriptorium. This sacred writing had become the ultimate symbol of their resistance and identity, and concern for its safety had turned into an almost obsessive paranoia. The book that contained the words of eternal life was now kept in a state of constant readiness for immediate concealment, wrapped in raw linen and ready to be placed in a specially prepared, hollowed-out hiding place in the rock beneath the floor, should the guard on the tower raise the alarm. The final, most devastating attack that finally broke the community's spirit of resistance came.
Chapter 7. The Sea Road to Kells. The solemn procession leaving the ruined walls of the monastery on the island of Iona was like a mournful procession of shadows, moving in the dramatic, flickering light of tar torches that cut through the thick darkness of the early dawn. The monk brothers, dressed in rough woolen habits in the colors of faded moss, peat, and deep gray, stepped almost silently over the wet stones, glistening with morning dew, carrying on their shoulders a burden heavier than the oak and iron from which it was forged. At the center of this somber procession was a massive, exquisitely carved box, sealed with hot tar and wrapped in multi-layered, oiled ox hides, within which lay the most sacred treasure of their congregation, the Great Gospel. The torchlight cast deep Caravasian shadows on the gaunt faces of the monks, bringing out from the darkness their desperation, fear, but above all, their unshakable faith in the mission they had to fulfill. The aged Brother Kuan, whose hands, once so precise with quill pens and saturated with pigments, now trembled with cold and age, walked right next to the chest, refusing to abandon it even at arm's length. His eyes, set deep in his wrinkled face, gleamed feverishly as soft verses of Latin defense psalms emerged from his parched lips, blending with the sound of the wind blowing in from the sea. The air smelled of salty breeze, rotting seaweed and smoke, creating an atmosphere filled with an almost physically felt tension, heralding the inevitable farewell to the only home they had ever known. The flotilla of curraghs, the only hope of saving and transporting the priceless manuscript to the safe haven of Kells, bobbed restlessly in the dark leaden waters of the small bay, hitting the wooden piers with a dull rhythmic thud. These simple, seemingly fragile boats, built of flexible ash frames and covered with a thick triple layer of animal skins sewn with straps, seemed absurdly defenseless against the vastness and severity of the Irish Sea. The smell of melted animal fat, which had been liberally soaked into the skins to make them waterproof, mixed with the pungent smell of resin and tar, creating a suffocating mixture that settled in the throats of the brothers as they prepared to set sail. The box with the book was lowered with the utmost care to the bottom of the flagship, the largest boat, and each movement of the monks was like performing a sacred ritual in which the slightest mistake could cost the entire spiritual heritage of their people. Finian, who had transformed from a terrified novice into a strong, capable young man, took his place at one of the oars, swallowing hard as his eyes fell on the outlines of the monastery towers that had been a refuge from the brutality of the outside world for years, disappearing into the morning fog.
The loading of belongings, water barrels, and dry rations took place in deathly silence, broken only by the creaking of tensioned ropes and the splash of icy water lapping the leather sides as the monks took their places on the narrow benches. When the first oars plunged into the water, breaking its glassy surface, an overwhelming sadness mixed with panic fear of the unknown filled the travelers' hearts, and each subsequent movement of their arms took them further from the past, forcing them to confront the merciless open ocean. The open sea space initially greeted them with a deceptive calm, stretching before the bows of the boats an endless navy blue and gray surface, which became more and more ominous and unpredictable with each mile they sailed. Brother Cuan sat huddled at the bottom of the corach, wrapped in a heavy, damp woolen cloak, his thin arms wrapped around the carved chest as if to protect the sheets of parchment hidden within from the frost and salt with his own body. In his mind, cut off from the world around him.
Chapter 8. A New Sanctuary.
The journey was drawing to a close, and the exhausted monks of Iona, bearing the invisible scars of salt, icy wind, and brutal Norse slaughter on their bodies and souls, trudged with their last ounce of strength through the muddy, endless tracks of the kingdom of Mide in the heart of Ireland. The landscape surrounding this silent procession of refugees was harsh and unforgiving, filled with the smell of burning peat, rotting autumn leaves, and the damp, black earth that seemed to maliciously pull at their aching, blistered feet with every, even the smallest, step towards salvation. The cold, bone-chilling wind from the Irish Sea was still making its presence felt, whipping their emaciated faces and tearing at their thick, once warm woolen habits, which, after weeks of dramatic wandering, resembled more a collection of mended rags than the dignified attire of God's servants. At the head of this pitiful group, yet exuding extraordinary inner dignity, walked the abbot of Sellach, whose eyes, although deeply darkened and red from terrible lack of sleep and hidden grief, stared with an almost fanatical intensity at the outlines of the vast monastic settlement in Kells looming on the misty horizon. In the middle of the procession, carried on a makeshift stretcher made of rough pine poles by 4 of the strongest brothers, lay a huge oak chest bound with blackened iron, hiding in its dark interior the only reason they had survived this hell on earth, the priceless, still unfinished Great Gospel, saved from the Viking massacre like a holy ark sailing through a sea of blood and despair. Each of the monks felt this physical and spiritual burden not only in their bleeding, abraded arms, but also in their hearts, with the absolute certainty that saving this superhuman manuscript was their highest, final duty towards God, Saint Columba, and the murdered friends whose mutilated bodies remained on the sandy beaches of Iona, given over to the merciless prey of the ravens and the sea waves. When at last the clear, solid outlines of the wooden palisade and tall stone defensive towers of Kells began to emerge from the grey, leaden mists of the morning, a quiet, hoarse sigh of unspeakable relief escaped from their tired chests, and hot tears appeared in their eyes, which they no longer had the strength or desire to hold back, firmly believing that after long months of merciless wandering and paralyzing fear, they had finally, by the will of the Most High, reached the gates of their home, a new, safe sanctuary. As the massive oak gates of the Kells monastic settlement finally began to open with a dull, long creak, the Iona travellers were struck by the physical contrast between their own wretched condition and the peaceful, well-organized life of the large monastic community here. The high wooden palisade, steep earthworks, and deep moats offered a real promise of security and durability that had been completely forgotten on the sea-torn, defenseless island of Iona, which had fallen victim to the Norse fury.
as the brothers from Iona slowly shuffled across the hallowed threshold of the monastery, an almost absolute, reverent silence fell in the vast inner courtyard, broken only by the occasional, monotonous bleating of sheep grazing on the surrounding hills and the rustling of the wind in the crowns of the old oaks. The local monks, dressed in clean, unworn, grey-brown habits, interrupted their daily work in the gardens, forges, and mills, to watch with a mixture of shock, pity, and great respect the entry of the fugitives, who looked like spectres returning from the very depths of hell. The sight of these hungry travellers, covered in dried blood and mud, proudly carrying their iron-bound chest with the last of their strength, made many of the inhabitants of Kells unconsciously fall to their knees, making the sign of the cross in the face of such great sacrifice and heroism. Clean Kells air, free from the ubiquitous.
Chapter 9. Noc pustego relikwiarza.
200 years have passed since those turbulent days when the Book of Kells, a miraculous work of human hands and divine inspiration, found its safe haven within the mighty stone walls of the abbey. Over these 2 centuries, the legend of the manuscript grew with each successive generation of monks who reverently passed down stories of its miraculous rescue. No longer just a collection of Gospels, the book became the beating heart of Kells, the ultimate symbol of the golden age of Irish monasticism, proof that even in the darkest hours the light of faith and knowledge can endure. To pay tribute to this extraordinary treasure, the monastic community founded a magnificent kumvak, a reliquary in the form of a decorative cover which was intended to protect the priceless vellum cards. This elaborate container was a masterpiece of contemporary craftsmanship, intricately carved from the purest gold and silver, studded with precious stones that sparkled in the candlelight like stars in the night sky. Emeralds as deep as Irish forests, rubies as red as the blood of martyrs, and sapphires like the stormy waters of the North Atlantic adorned its surface, creating a stunning contrast to the stark grey stone of the cells and corridors. For every pilgrim and monk seeing the book resting in its reliquary was a mystical experience, a moment when temporality met eternity and art became prayer. The golden setting not only protected the word of God, but was itself a song of praise, a material proof of the Creator's infinite love and devotion, intensifying the aura of holiness that hovered over this place like thick incense during the most important liturgical holidays. The monks believed that this vessel was the Ark of the Covenant of their time, inviolable and eternal. However, the year 1006 brought with it winds of change and unrest that would shake the foundations of this safe world and shatter their illusion of inviolability. The lands around Kells Abbey, although far from the main trade routes and coastlines that were once so often haunted by the ruthless Vikings, were not free from bloody conflicts between local warlords and self-proclaimed kings competing for power. The night on which the unimaginable tragedy was to take place was exceptionally harsh, as if nature itself sensed the approaching evil and tried to warn the sleeping inhabitants. A cold, piercing wind howled between the stone towers, carrying with it the smell of damp peat and rotting leaves, reminding us of the fragility of human life in the face of the raging elements. Clouds thickly covered the moon, immersing the entire area in a thick, impenetrable darkness that seemed to absorb all sources of light and heat. In this inky darkness, taking advantage of the chaos caused by the recent military skirmishes on the outskirts of the abbey's territory, dark, stealthy figures silently approached the monastery walls. These were not pagans from across the sea, seeking slaves and glory in pagan warfare, but ordinary, ruthless thieves whose hearts had been completely poisoned by greed and moral decay.
Their goal was not spiritual enlightenment or the destruction of the Christian heritage out of hatred for the faith. They only desired raw wealth, material value that would allow them to forget for a while the misery and brutality of their own existence. They were like predators stalking through the tall grass, aware of every little sound, ready to strike at any moment, completely indifferent to the sacred nature of the place they were about to enter, and to the historical and religious importance of the object that became the target of their evil intentions. Penetrating the outer, time-worn fortifications of the monastery did not require a large army or siege machines, just a clever knowledge of weak points in the old wall, a bit of dexterity, and a moment of inattention on the part of the cold, tired guards who, due to the terrible cold...
Chapter 10. Wrapped in Sod. 2 excruciatingly long months, filled with agony and absolute silence, had passed since that cursed night that forever changed the face of the ancient Abbey of Kells. The community of monks, once teeming with joyful life and holy creative zeal, had almost lost all hope, sinking into a deep lethargy and crushing despair that resembled the thick, impenetrable fog that shrouded the rugged Celtic hills every morning. The brothers gave up, forced by the cruel passage of time to accept the unimaginable fact that their greatest treasure, their life's work, and the physical manifestation of divine light on earth was lost forever in the darkness of a barbaric world. The scriptorium, previously filled with the soothing sound of scraped parchment, the smell of resin ink, and the silent prayers of master illuminators, now stood empty, terrifyingly cold and lifeless, resembling a plundered tomb from which the body of the greatest of saints had been brutally stolen. Abbot Sellach, a man of indomitable will and steely character, aged an entire decade during those 80 days marked by bile and tears. His broad shoulders sagged under the weight of guilt, and in his eyes, previously burning with the fanatical vision of building a great defensive wall, every spark was extinguished, giving way to a bottomless, grey void. The prayers in the main church became automated, devoid of their former passion and exultation, as if the devastated monks believed that with the disappearance of their great book, God himself had finally turned his bright face away from them, leaving them at the mercy of a harsh, merciless, violent world. Each new day brought only the same dull, leaden morning light that cruelly highlighted the brutal absence of the gospel book, and each sleepless night brought feverish nightmares of sacrilegious, dirty hands tearing apart the priceless, intricately decorated pages and throwing them into the flames. The atmosphere throughout Kells was like a constant, dark vigil at a deathbed, where no miracle, even the smallest one, was allowed to happen again, and the golden reliquary that had previously proudly protected the book was now only a painful, empty reminder of human greed, weakness, and fall, casting long, dark shadows over the souls stricken with horror. Meanwhile, far beyond the perimeter of the great walls of Kells, where the sacred ended and the brutal, muddy prose of everyday survival began, there lived a farmer named Aidan, a man broken by wind, rain, and constant work on the rocky, thankless earth. His field was located on the very outskirts of the monastery estate, on a bleak slope descending into a swampy valley, where the wind from the North Atlantic blew with such force that it forced you to bow your head to your chest. On this particular morning, the sky was the color of bruised flesh, and the cold, driving rain mixed with Aidan's own sweat, dripping down his sunken cheeks and soaking into the rough woolen tunic that now weighed almost as much as his chainmail. The farmer led his heavy wooden plough harnessed to a huge ox, equally tired of life, trying to wring at least the promise of future harvests from this barren soil, struggling with every metre of the muddy, sticky terrain.
It was an absolutely primal struggle, man's struggle against the unyielding matter of the elements, where each step required maximum muscle tension, and breathing was like swallowing icy sand due to the piercing cold that froze the blood in the veins. Aidan did not think about great politics, about Viking raids, or about the great tragedies of the monks on the hill. His world was limited to the steady rhythm of ox hooves, the sound of cutting sod, and the smell of freshly turned black earth, which was the whole meaning of his difficult existence. His whole body ached from old injuries and lack of food, but his work routine forced him to move mechanically and tensely.
Chapter 11. The Shadow of Cromwell.
600 years is a vast ocean of time in which mighty empires fall, great cities turn to smouldering ashes, and the names of ancient rulers become but faded whispers of the wind on desolate moors. But within the cold, austere stone walls of the ancient Abbey of Kells, time seemed to flow according to a completely different, hallowed and mystical measure. Throughout all these long centuries, from the bloody raids of the Vikings from the barbaric north, through the advent of the steel-clad Norman knights, to the dark and turbulent days of the brutal breakdown of Christian unity in Europe during the early Reformation, the Book of Kells has stood unshakable as the unchanging guardian of faith, art, and collective memory. Generations of monks came and went in the quiet, monotonous rhythm of monastic life, their faces wrinkled like old, dried parchments, their backs hunched under the unbearable weight of years and endless prayers, and their hands, at first young, smooth, and strong, began to tremble noticeably over the decades as they turned with reverent reverence and infinite tender gentleness priceless, stunningly illuminated manuscript pages. The seasons changed. The harsh, unforgiving Irish winters covered the carved Celtic crosses with a thick layer of frost, sparkling in the sun, and the short springs, bursting with vivid greenery, brought fleeting renewal around the ancient monastic walls. But inside the scriptorium and the stuffy library, in the mystical twilight illuminated only by the flickering warm glow of wax candles, an uninterrupted, sacred ritual of care continued over this miracle of human hands. By some superhuman miracle, the book survived the ruthless dissolution of monasteries during the times of the cruel King Henry VIII, when throughout Ireland and England priceless relics collected over the centuries were desecrated and systematically robbed. The roofs of ancient Romanesque churches were torn off for valuable lead, and hundreds of years of rich history were reduced to useless ashes in the name of royal pride and greed. It survived this first great crisis because its steadfast guardians at that time, fully aware of its supernatural, transcendent value, had learned the difficult art of concealment, deep silence, and silent, steadfast determination, passing on the dark secret of its position from generation to generation like the most holy, inviolable sacrament. Over the years, it has become much more than just a collection of the Latin texts of the four Gospels. It has become the beating, pulsating heart of a hidden, proud Irish identity, a living, tangible proof that amidst the all-encompassing darkness of barbarism, war, and political turmoil, an absolute, unearthly beauty can survive, completely beyond human rational understanding. The colours of the extraordinary pigments used to create it, deep lapis lazuli imported from the distant Afghan mountains, bright ornament resembling liquid gold, blood red and malachite green, still gleamed on the smooth calf-coloured vellum with an intensity that immediately took the breath away of everyone who had the honour of looking at it, reminding them of the power of the spirit of the old masters who poured their entire mortal lives into this work.
In this hypnotic montage of quickly passing centuries, each careful touch of the page by subsequent monks, each passionately whispered prayer over an open, huge book, each tear of sincere emotion shed at the sight of the perfect, almost impossible weave of initials, built an invisible spiritual armor of survival, preparing this miraculous manuscript for the greatest, most devastating test which was inevitably to come in the middle of the gloomy 17th century, when humanity was to show its worst, most fanatical face. The 1750s brought a darkness so thick, choking and palpable over the tortured Emerald Isle that it seemed literally.
Chapter 12. Droga do Dublina.
Heavy leaden clouds billowed over Kells Tower, and relentless rain pounded against the stone walls of the garrison, a harbinger of imminent, inevitable doom that was approaching with the inexorable march of Cromwell's troops. In the stuffy, dimly lit chamber, the city's governor paced nervously from wall to wall, and each of his steps echoed dully on the wooden oak floorboards, vibrating with the weight of a decision that was to determine the fate of one of the most sacred artifacts of the Christian world. On a massive, time-worn table, lit only by the flickering, capricious flame of a single tallow candle, rested an irregularly shaped bundle, wrapped in thick, raw wool and greased hides, intended to protect its priceless contents from moisture and unauthorized eyes. The governor, a man of secular rather than spiritual power, was well aware of the irony of the situation in which he, a pragmatic soldier and administrator, became the last line of defense for the Book of Kells. He knew that the puritanical zeal of the new model soldiers would not spare elaborate gilded illuminations or pages written on calfskin parchment. For them it was only papist heresy, idolatry deserving only of the stake. This conscious, rational fear of destroying a legacy that transcended the boundaries of a single religion led him to undertake a risky, covert operation to wrest the manuscript from the hands of approaching fanatics and move it to the relative safety of Dublin. It was no longer a disorderly, panicked flight of terrified monks, as had happened centuries ago during the Viking raids on Iona, but a coldly calculated, precisely planned evacuation mission carried out by state authority, which in itself was a turning point in the long, turbulent history of the book. The governor stopped at the table, placing his hand on the rough wool, and the thought flashed through his mind that in that one moment the weight of hundreds of years of prayers, calligraphers' patience, and miraculous survival rested solely on his shoulders, forcing him to act against all odds. The chamber door creaked softly, letting in a gust of damp, cold air, and the figure of Captain O'Rourke, a trusted officer whose loyalty had been forged in the heat of countless skirmishes and battles, not in the privacy of a monastery. O'Rourke was a man with hard features, scarred and weathered, and his wet leather cloak gave off a strong scent of rain, horse sweat, and peat fire smoke, a sharp contrast to the fragility of the object he would soon protect. The governor nodded, desperation mixed with ruthless determination in his eyes, as he began to give his final orders in a quiet, barely audible whisper, aware that even the walls might have ears in a city full of spies and traitors. He was explaining to the captain that what was on the table was not simply spoils of war or a chest of gold, but the very heart and soul of their land, a work of art whose value transcends all human imagination and which must endure at all costs. O'Rourke listened in silence, his face unreadable in the deep shadows cast by the candle, and although he knew no Latin and had never explored theological mysteries, he understood perfectly the gravity of the situation and the absolute necessity of completing the mission without asking unnecessary questions.
Respectfully, but also with the raw brutality of a man used to handling weapons, he took the package in his large, calloused hands, surprised by its weight, and then hid it deep under his coat. This exchange, carried out in silence and twilight, was a symbolic moment of transferring custody of the Book of Kells from the sacred sphere, where it was revered by monks, to the profane sphere, into the hands of soldiers, for whom it was a task to be performed.
Chapter 13. Przystan Uczonych. The year 1661 came with a heavy, damp echo of approaching change, carrying with it a wind of renewal that dispersed the stifling and bloody fumes of the Cromwellian era, replacing them with the cautious, cool breath of the Stuart Restoration, when a king once again sat on the British throne, and the world seemed for a moment hold its breath, trying to find the lost balance between the brutal power of the sword and the subtler but equally powerful power of law and intellect. In the heart of this restless Dublin, waking up from the nightmare of civil war, a city made of ubiquitous mud, gray stone, and smoke from peat fires, a man was preparing to commit an act that would forever change the fate of Ireland's greatest treasure. Henry Jones, once the ruthless and cunning chief scout in Oliver Cromwell's own army, a man who had seen destruction and blood, and who now, as he shed his armor and put on the robes of Bishop of Meath and Vice-Chancellor of Trinity College, had undergone a profound metamorphosis of his own, sat in his dark oak study, where the light fell only from one narrow window, dancing in dust particles like on Caravaggio's canvases. In front of him, on a massive table, rested a book that had survived longer than any man or empire. The Book of Kells, wrapped in raw cloth and leather, emanated a strange, almost physically felt gravity in the twilight, catching the eye of the bishop, who stroked its cover with his scarred hands, feeling under his fingers 850 years of history, wars, escapes, Viking axes, broken monasteries, and the iron cold of winter. Thinking with bitter irony how he, a former soldier of the Puritan army destroying Catholic relics, became the ultimate defender and guardian of this absolute masterpiece of the ancient Celtic faith, taking a step that was to define his legacy and provide the book with a security unlike any other she experienced from the day she was born on the windy island of Iona. The journey through the narrow, muddy, and noisy streets of Dublin was like a passage through purgatory, in which the carriage carrying Henry Jones and his priceless cargo had to make its way through crowds of traders, beggars, carts filled with coal, and gutters flowing with muddy brown water, while the bishop himself sat inside the carriage motionless, holding both hands on a heavy, iron-bound chest made of dark oak, inside which, safe from the dirt and drudgery of the outside world, rested a book, an absolute antithesis to the prosaic misery surrounding them, pulsing secretly with its jeweled colors. Every jolt of the carriage, every impact of the wooden wheels against the cat's head reminded him of the incredible fragility of matter and how close this absolute miracle of human genius intertwined with divine inspiration was to burn in one of the thousands of fires that have consumed this island for centuries, and therefore his face, illuminated again and again by the darkness and light coming through the window, expressed not only the tension but also the weight of ultimate responsibility, and the soldiers escorting the carriage, dressed in thick, noise-deadening woolen coats in shades of peat brown and dusty gray, cast grim glances at passers-by, creating a shield between the harsh, unpredictable, and often cruel world and the silence and perfection hidden inside a locked chest, heading towards what would become the new, final temple for this banished artifact. When the carriage finally stopped and the heavy, arched gates of Trinity College opened with a dull, majestic creak, the sound meant more than just crossing the threshold of an educational institution. It was the sound of the gates closing behind uncertainty and opening doors to eternity. And the moment the horses entered the cobbled courtyard, the bustle and chaos of the street was immediately cut off by thick stone walls, replaced by a... Chapter 15. a legacy of light.
The atmosphere of the long room in Trinity College, Dublin, is not merely a matter of architectural grandeur. It is a profound, almost overwhelming sensory experience that serves as a monumental cathedral for the human mind, a sanctuary where the collective memory of civilization is fiercely preserved in wood, leather, and ancient ink. The air itself feels incredibly old, heavy with the subtle, sweet scent of decaying paper, polished oak, beeswax, and the imperceptible dust of centuries, settling quietly in the distinct shafts of light that pierce the scholarly gloom. Here, beneath the magnificent sweeping barrel-vaulted ceiling, flanked by the stern, silent marble busts of philosophers, scientists, and poets who stare blindly into the dimness, rests an object that utterly transcends its physical form. It is contained within a state-of-the-art, climate-controlled glass case, bathed in a meticulously calibrated dramatic illumination that evokes the masterful, high-contrast chiaroscuro of Caravaggio, where shadows are unfathomably deep and hidden secrets are numerous. The focused light strikes the uneven, undulating surface of the vellum, revealing the undeniable organic truth of its origins, the subtle, microscopic patterns of hair follicles from a calf that grazed on the damp emerald grasses of a remote Scottish island long before the very concept of modern European nations existed. The book lies open, presenting a vibrant, breathtaking explosion of earthy moss greens, deep peat browns, striking lapis lazuli blues, and radiant, luminous golds, providing a stark and miraculous contrast to the solemn stone grays and solemn dark woods of its immediate surroundings. It is the Book of Kells, and to look upon it is to realize that it is not simply a religious manuscript or an artifact of medieval piety, but a monumental anchor dropped into the rushing, destructive river of time, a physical manifestation of a legacy of light that has stubbornly refused to be extinguished by the relentless, crushing weight of 12 chaotic, brutal centuries. To stand before it in the hushed, reverent silence of this monumental room is to confront the sheer, implausible miracle of its survival, to realize that this fragile, bound collection of prepared animal skin, crushed minerals, and soot has somehow endured through countless ages of fire, bloodshed, and profound darkness, emerging as an ultimate testament to the indestructible human impulse to create and fiercely protect beauty. The creation of such a masterpiece in the historical period, commonly and perhaps unfairly dismissed as the Dark Ages, represents an act of staggering, almost incomprehensible defiance against the prevailing forces of entropy, chaos, and societal collapse that defined early medieval Europe. It is essential to grasp the sheer, staggering economic and human cost that the production of this single volume required from the isolated monastic community that birthed it on the wind-swept, sea-battered island of Iona. Over 185 calves had to be carefully selected, slaughtered, and their skins subjected to a grueling, labor-intensive process of soaking in lime vats, stretching agonizingly tight on wooden frames, and scraping endlessly with curved crescent knives known as lunellums until the flesh and hair were entirely gone, leaving only the incredibly smooth, resilient surface of the parchment. This massive diversion of agricultural resources in a society constantly teetering on the devastating edge of famine was an astonishing declaration of priorities, a statement that the nourishment of the human soul through divine beauty was considered just as crucial, if not more so, than the sustenance of the physical body. Furthermore, the brilliant jewel-like pigments that adorn the thick pages were not locally sourced, but were the ultimate result of unimaginably vast, incredibly dangerous trade networks that spanned the known medieval world and beyond. The breadth